So our next speaker is international superstar and heavyweight games industry champion, James Everett. James has worked for 15 years in the Canadian game development hubs of Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, and he is currently a lead game designer at Magic Leap and Weta Workshop here in Wellington. He has contributed to games ranging from the award-winning blockbuster Shatter to the award-winning spy fantasy game Splinter Cell Blacklist. James has served as chairperson of the New Zealand Game Developers Association since 2016. Today, James is going to talk to us about the New Zealand games industry. If you don't think the games industry is for you or your students, you will soon. So please, sit back, put your feet up and enjoy the smooth like maple syrup, Canadian sounds of James Everett. James.
With an intro like that, what else am I going to do? Oh my goodness. Thanks very much, Dan. So let's talk game dev. Hi, I'm James. Yesterday I had the good fortune to try to use the Media Maker program, and I did not succeed enough to be confident enough to deliver that. So instead I'm just going to point to this picture and say, this is where I'm from. This is Comox in the Comox Valley, Vancouver Island. And it's where I grew up, in a really small town, just down the road from an Air Force base, and technically Regional Area B, although we call it Cape Lazo, where we're from. So I started my career, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of context for kind of where I've been, because what I'd like to do as much as possible is make this a bit of a dialogue. I'd like to answer as many questions as I can for you, because I don't know really what you'd like to know or what you'd need to know. So just as context, I started my career in Vancouver about 2001, depending on how you count it. Made some video games there. I went out to Montreal, where I discovered that different sides of Canada are very different temperatures. Vancouver Island is a lot like here. You go and visit the snow and then you come home. That's fine. Montreal, the snow comes to you, it's -40, and you wonder why your lungs are freezing. From Montreal, I fled, and I came to Wellington for the first time in 2008. And I was very fortunate to work with a company called She. We made a game called Shatter and Madagascar Carts and some other things. They've now grown and become a company called Pickpock, but it's the same crew. Mario and the team there just celebrated their 20th year in business, which makes them the longest running game company in New Zealand and probably the longest running game company in Australasia, I think. I went back to Canada, to Toronto, where it's only marginally warmer than Montreal, and worked for a few years with Ubisoft Toronto on Splinter Cell and another project, which I'll show you a little bit of video from, so that I've at least got something shiny to talk about, because it's been a long time since I've been able to talk about anything I've shipped. I realized the other day Facebook very helpfully reminded me it's been 4 years since Splinter Cell came out. So I'm looking forward to being able to talk about things eventually, because I came back to New Zealand to work with Magic Leap and Weta Workshop. And Magic Leap is a hardware company. They're from Florida primarily, but there's also teams in California, a couple different spots, Seattle, Austin, Dallas, Tel Aviv, Zurich, and I think London, and then us here in Wellington. And in partnership with Weta Workshop, we're working on sort of the Halo for their Xbox, if you will. We're making a big, shiny game for their hardware. And it's mixed reality hardware, which means you can see the real world, and we put digital content in it, which is a very strange experience. And because I like doing 3 things at once, or 4 things at once, when I first got back to New Zealand, it was shortly before the elections for the New Zealand Game Developers Association board. And I said, well, I've spent some time in New Zealand before, and I know lots of folks, and I've done a lot of community work in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal. Maybe I can help out. Next thing I know, I spent a year with the board and thought that was pretty cool. And then the past chair was like, I could use a break. And I said, maybe I could help out. Next thing I know, I'm the chair. So I've been chair for a year, and we've done, I think, a lot of really wonderful work with the association from the industry standpoint. But with everything that's coming up with Magic Leap over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, I know that I can't give it the time I need to give it. So unfortunately, I'm now the outgoing chairperson, but there's a great new board coming in next week and lots of good stuff happening. And I did some math just because I was wondering. I was looking at these lines going, how far is that? Turns out I've relocated over 47,000 kilometers in my life. It's just a bit of a hike. So I started my career as a level designer, making environments and the worlds that people would run around in. And I had this vision in my head that being a game designer was really something like this, right? I would have perfect knowledge, and I would say, this is the game, and the game will be this, and it will be good. And you know, it's just this one person's vision. And the reality is that if you treat game development like that, you're a lot more like this guy. And so what I've discovered over the years as I kind of keep away at this and had some rather youthful notions disabused from my head was that it's a lot more like this. It's really, I spend a lot of time talking with people and communicating and trying to explain why things are important and why other things are less important, and being told why things are very important from a technical artistic standpoint, and then incorporating that information into the design. But there are many, many, many kinds of game designer. This is like, as a catch-all term, it's one thing, but these are literally, my co-lead game designer, Jimmy, put together this list. He's like, here's all the different kinds of specializations you can get into in game design, right? Everything from, you know, of course, puzzle design and how inventories work, character behaviors and artificial intelligence, but traps, tutorials, user interface, like these are all different areas of game design. And I'm very good at a couple of them. I'm middling at a few of them, and I'm kind of junk at most of them. My specialization has really been around, as I say, communication and leadership for the last sort of 10 years. But there's many ways to approach this problem. So as I say, I think to me the big stuff is really about communication, about facilitation. I negotiate a lot of arguments and a lot of rocky waters for people and make sure that everyone hopefully comes to the same conclusion. And I'm also a filter at the end of the day, and that's one of the big parts of my job as a lead game designer is I know what the game director wants, as much as I can anyways, and I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that his vision is communicated clearly to the team. And then when people say, I've got this great idea, and they do, because it is almost certainly a good idea. People don't tend to pipe up when they've got a terrible idea. They usually only say something when they're like, I'm excited about this. That's someone giving you their energy. They're giving you their time. They're giving you their excitement. Worst thing you can do is say, that's bad. Nobody needs that. Nobody enjoys that. So instead, I act as a bit of a filter. And so people say, I've got this great idea. And I'm like, cool, does that fit? Does it fit right now? Does it fit later? Does it fit in that shape, or does it fit in this shape? Or does it just not fit at all because it's not going to match up with what we're trying to do for any number of variety of reasons? So that's kind of what I do, game design standpoint. Sorry, I'm messing myself up. As I say, at any point, if you've got questions, just throw a hand up, and I'll try and keep an eye out for it, and we'll just do that, because I'd like to do that as much as we can. Thanks, Tara. I stole your slide from this morning. The thing about game development in general is game development challenges all of these things. This is what we have to do all the time, right? The communication skills, those are probably the paramount skill in game development, working in a team. Creativity, always and forever. Cultural engagement is a very interesting one. It made me stop and think, and I'm not going to go off on that tangent right now because we'd be here all day. But I think that it's something that game developers in a commercial medium are often very poor at addressing in a proactive way, we'll say. I think a lot of people make something because they kind of think it's cool. It is, of course, informed by their cultural values, their experiences, and everything else they do. But actually engaging with the culture around them is sometimes a challenge for a lot of developers, and it's one that I hope that we do a little bit more and a lot more better. Critical thinking is something that is just absolutely key to how we approach this stuff. Collaboration and curiosity, if we don't bring those to the table, we're lonely, and being a lonely game developer is not a lot of fun. It's very challenging. You'll hear stories of, you know, independent game developers who work by themselves, and some of my friends work as one-person shops, and the biggest challenge for them is loneliness. And it's very, very difficult. So they will try to come together whenever they can to work together. In my day job, there's 35 of us on one team, and so I'm never lonely. And there's a lot of collaboration and curiosity there. So I'd like to give you a quick kind of overview of what the New Zealand Game Developers Association is about. And for the first time ever, you're getting the exclusive. We have the survey results for 2016 for the industry in New Zealand, and it's quite promising, which is really wonderful. So you're the first people outside of the board to see these so far. So the NZGA was founded in 2001, so been around for quite some time. Its more kind of modern incarnation probably dates back to 2010, but there's lots of the same people have been involved, as the backbone of the New Zealand game industry for a long time. There's about 30 studios in New Zealand that we actively participate with, approximately 500 full-time, equivalent employees around New Zealand. Lots and lots, of course, of students, because our membership sits somewhere around the 1,200, 1,400 mark. As I say, it's a little bit fuzzy because we don't have like a really rigid membership structure. If you're interested and you want to be in, you're in. That's kind of how we treat it. So the things that we focus on are networking, community building. Pretty standard stuff. Raising the industry profile, so wherever we can, we try to highlight our members' work. Supporting entrepreneurship through a couple of programs and through, that I'll speak about in just a moment. Professional development, primarily through our conference every year with the New Zealand Game Developers Conference, and also supporting the work, the meetups around New Zealand. Encouraging career pathways, so we spend a fair bit of time when possible and when invited, obviously, speaking with students and usually at the tertiary level, but we're hoping to spend more time primary and secondary over the next few years. Helping them understand, what tools they need and what avenues are available to them to come into game development. And lastly, advocacy. We spend a lot of time trying to explain to government folks what the game industry is, what we do, why it's so valuable for New Zealand. So the big one that I mentioned, so this is actually next week. So the New Zealand Game Developers Conference will be at AUT up in Auckland from the 6th to the 8th of September. We're really excited about this year. There is 3 days of conference. Our Wednesday is all workshops, so if you ever wanted to use Unity or Unreal for something, there's a workshop for that. There's a great workshop on leadership, intellectual property, and legal side of things. Thursday and Friday are just speaker days, so we're running, I think, 6 streams simultaneously, about 40, how many speakers? A bunch? Lots of speakers. And it'll be a really good time, so we're really excited about that. And this is sort of the big event for the game industry in New Zealand every year, and it's been growing thanks largely to the efforts of folks like Ben here for the last few years. So it's going to be pretty big this year. The other thing that we do there, and this is where some of the entrepreneurship stuff comes in, is Kiwi Game Starter. Kiwi Game Starter is basically open to everyone, and it's a contest where studios pitch their game, and out of all of the pitches that come in the door, and this year there was about 15, last year it was 30-something, and it's been probably well over 100 over the last few years we've been running it. Studios pitch their game. The 4 finalists are chosen. They come to Auckland and they pitch our finalist judging panel, and 2 of them get picked. One's the winner, one's runner-up. The support that we're able to offer is fairly minimal. The NZGA is a nonprofit. All of the board positions are volunteer. The entire conference is run by volunteers. So what we can offer is very minimal, but it's $10,000 for first place, $5,000 for second place, along with some legal and technical support and things like that. It's not a lot, but it gives game developers in New Zealand every year somewhere to focus their efforts and a chance to try and build a really compelling pitch, which obviously helps them a whole lot when they're going out and trying to talk to consumers and players. So, game industry survey, just give you a sense of the size of the industry in New Zealand and what we're doing. This year, we are a whisker off $100 million of annual turnover in New Zealand, which is great. So that is pretty significant growth since we started recording these numbers in 2012. So we go out to as many studios as we can in New Zealand. We ask them for further feedback. It's anonymized data done by Tim Thorpe Consulting, so the board itself doesn't see this stuff. It actually just comes in and gets aggregated, provided back to us. But this is really exciting because 97% of this stuff is exports, right? So this is all, we address the New Zealand market because we address the whole world. And everything has to go out of New Zealand for us to really survive. So we start off by thinking about, of course, our friends, our families, our communities, who we are as players and what we're excited about. And then from there, we have to immediately start thinking about the rest of the world because the New Zealand market isn't big enough to support a studio, even a relatively small studio. Yep. I don't really know. It shifts around over time. You know, partly it'll be. So I'm going to make a couple of educated guesses, and they are guesses because I haven't had time to dig into the data that much, and it would be a whole case study thing. But I suspect that that's a combination of what you call lifestyle games. So there's games like Destiny and World of Warcraft and other games that players can engage in long term. And as those games are still, particularly in the retail space, expensive in New Zealand. Like if you coming from Canada, you're like, oh, games are about $50. You get here and you look at a game on the shelf, brand new, it's $100. Okay, that pretty immediately reduces your options. And so what games? The other question, of course, is what games are our members making? And so some of our members are making games like mobile titles, like Pickpock does. Others are making console and PC stuff that may not appeal to the local market as much. Or the local market might just be not as addressable by those products. So again, kind of very speculative, but that's where I'd probably start looking. Sure.
Question right there while you have paused. I was just wondering if you had any input or into the consultation process for the new curriculum, because there are very exciting things happening around that. And so if you could just talk about that, that'd be great.
I have not. I know a few members have. I've heard about it, but we were not directly engaged. We reached out a couple of times and didn't really find the right people to talk to. So maybe there's someone here who knows who I should chat with. But yeah, we didn't really get involved in that, unfortunately, and I think that was a missed opportunity on our part. The last few months have been hectic. But I would very much like to chat with anybody who knows about that here. If you've got time. Just give you an idea of where the studios are in New Zealand. So of course, the bulk of them are up in Auckland, but there's quite a few here in Wellington. Do I have a laser? Hey, I think that's the Flightless crew in Mount Maunganui. They're great. Magic Jungle's over there. There's a few fairly established studios in Christchurch. Digital Confectioners and Cerebral Fix have been around for quite a while. And then in Dunedin, that's Runaway Play, who make the really beautiful games. I always do this, Splash and Flutter. I keep saying Flash and Splutter, and it's just not right. Anyways, they make these really wonderful games about sea creatures and about butterflies. And then Rocketworks on the other end of the spectrum is Dean Hall's new studio, which is making all kinds of stuff all over the show, including like a strange VR game about being out of ammo, which seems the opposite of what you'd expect in one of their games. But generally fairly distributed around the country. And this misses out, of course, the handful of independent and solo developers that are in various places, just doing their work on the coast and stuff. And very happily, the thing about game dev is you can kind of work from wherever your tools are at and wherever you've got an internet connection. So, hey, if you have a particular beach you really like, we got you covered. Just an idea of where these studios are focusing their effort. Most are independent developers. So this is a really big shift that's happened in the last sort of 5 years. For a long time, a lot of the sort of mid-tier studios, so to speak, mid-sized studios, worked in what we call a work-for-hire model. So someone would come to you like Disney and say, or actually, a perfect example, when I was at She, I think it was, who makes Madagascar, the Madagascar movies? Warner Brothers? DreamWorks, sorry. I should really know that. I spent a year on it. So DreamWorks would come to us and say, "Hey, we want you to make a game for the Madagascar movies." We're like, "Cool. What kind of game?" They're like, "Mario Kart." Like, all right. So I'm going to put animals in cars, and away we go. Cool. We got this. We made the world's fastest drifting game. Kids loved it. It was a good time. Made a game. But one of the pillars of the game was every member of the family must be able to play. So we did a cooperative racing mode where as you go around the track, you've got to, basically the timer's constantly ticking down. Every time you pass a gate, you add more time to the timer. Your gates get farther apart, the more gates you clear. But of course, that's on a per player basis. So with 4 players, family of 4 playing, if dad's not very good at racing games, his gates stay pretty close together. Meanwhile, his daughter's just like, I watched her with a Wii remote just like cruise around. She's like, the gates are getting really far apart. I can't see the next one. Meanwhile, her dad was stuck in the corner. But it meant that everyone in the family was able to contribute to racing together, which was a lot of fun. But anyways, that's work for hire stuff. So work for hire stuff is the intellectual property is owned by another studio, another publisher or IP holder like Warner Brothers or DreamWorks or whoever. We do the development for them, and if it sells enough copies, then we make some more money. But we don't own anything. At the end of the day, it comes to us, and then it leaves us, and that's it. Where we've shifted to, thanks to digital distribution and the fact that tools are now much more accessible across the board, is that most of the work in New Zealand is done by independent developers who own their intellectual property. That means if there's a great success, like in Angry Birds or something like that, or in case of digital confectioners, Depth is very successful. Mini Metro from Dinosaur Polo Club here in town, very successful. That work stays in New Zealand. That revenue stays in New Zealand. That tax stays in New Zealand. And those studios grow in New Zealand. Got a kind of mix of indie and contracts. So some teams, there's still a good chunk of teams who are taking contract work on in order to keep the lights on while they work on their own games. There's a handful who are still doing contract development. Some still working at outsourcing, which is just like very specific work of there's a very specific technical or artistic challenge they're hired to address. And there's actually a few working on tools development, which is making tools for other developers. Had an interesting dip there in the numbers. So we're back up to about 500 full-time employees across New Zealand. There's a lot of challenges, and I'll get to that in a second about how where we're trying to hire. But we had a dip from 2015 to 2016 when there was a large studio up in Auckland called Gameloft. And part of their Gameloft is a large multinational. They've got 30-something studios around the world. And unfortunately, they got caught in a bit of corporate warfare. There was another large French conglomerate wanted to buy out Gameloft. The CEO at Gameloft thought he could bump his share price by closing 5 studios around the world and making it too expensive for Vivendi to buy them. That didn't work. They bought them anyways, and 150 people lost their jobs for nothing because not a single other Gameloft studio has been closed since the buyout. So very frustrating. Did not reflect at all on the team, the company, New Zealand, Auckland. It was just unfortunate crap. So I'm still a bit annoyed about all that. Not nearly as annoyed, I'm sure, as people who lost their jobs. We were able to get a lot of those folks to stay in New Zealand, which was great. There was a lot of studios around New Zealand that were, like we're looking for probably about 93 new hires across 2017, 2018 in New Zealand. And that was roughly the same number back in 2015, 2016 when that happened. So a lot of folks were able to stay. There was quite a few, actually, not quite a few, but there was a few who had managed to get their residency, and they've since started studios in Auckland and elsewhere. So we've benefited from bringing those folks to New Zealand.
How many students or interns are coming out from New Zealand sources? Like you flooded with people trying to get in, and you've only got 93 jobs, or are you looking for people and just not enough people with the skills?
A good chunk of those jobs are in the sort of senior level, and unfortunately we do end up having to import for a lot of those. That's why, hi, I'm here, is because there's not enough senior talent in New Zealand to go around. So that's where immigration plays a factor. At the junior level, I don't know the actual number of graduates coming out in any given year. Off the top of my head, I suspect it's in sort of the low hundreds kind of range, probably 100, 150 a year. But that's, again, bit of guesswork. We don't have enough jobs for all those folks, and that's true around the world. My friend Liam Mesler from Australia did the math on what it is in Australia, and they actually have a bit of a overabundance of game development courses in Australia that kind of ramped up just before the global financial crash, and so those programs are still around, so lots of students coming out. So there's like 5% of the graduates will find jobs in Australia, which is a bit ridiculous, but we're not quite there, but it's not super high either.
Yeah, at the point where Gameloft closed, I think they had 6 interns, and it took them about 3 years to get to the point where they could be stable enough to handle taking interns.
Yeah, internships are we like doing them when we can. I've had 2 interns come through Magic Leap now in the last little while, but it's not something that we'll be repeating probably in the next 10 months or so because the opportunity cost is too high. We bring somebody in, we need to train them up. We need to get, they're not going to be able to hit the ground running 9 times out of 10. Although we got very lucky in the case of one of them who literally hit the ground running. It was exciting. But by and large, internships and those kinds of programs are, you have to be stable enough and have enough revenue coming in the door to support that person, because you've got to pay them. You've got to take time away from other developers to make sure that they get trained up appropriately. So internships are a bit challenging for us. This is a number that we're not happy about. So there's only 16% of the employees across New Zealand are women and in the game industry, and that's really not something that's to be proud of. The industry globally sits around 20%. It should be closer to 50-50, but speaking of tangents that would take me all day, that's a number that we're working on as much as we can, primarily in the way of, it's like we try to get developers to speak to students primarily at the tertiary level, and who we kind of put forward for that. We want to put as big a diversity of faces forward as we can, so people can go, oh, that's something I can do, and just like reinforce that. So just as context is where that sits kind of globally. So global games market, this year was about $101 billion. So we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get a bigger slice of that pie for New Zealand? And just as a point of comparison, New Zealand, we're about 4.7 million people in New Zealand, turnover $100 million in the last year. Finland, 5.6 million, so pretty close. 2.5 billion euro last year. So how do we bridge that gap? That's kind of the interesting challenge we're looking at. And a lot of that has to do with how studios are supported. So the big difference between New Zealand and Finland, or one of the big differences, is government support. The government in Finland has been very supportive of the game industry over the years, primarily through Tekes, which is like their sort of Callahan innovation equivalent. But they have quite a lot of room and quite a lot of flexibility in terms of how they support the industry there. So that's kind of numbers and bits and pieces from New Zealand industry. I'd also just like to show you something quickly from who plays games in New Zealand, really, where all those numbers come from. So IGEA, who are kind of a sister organization to us, the Interactive Games Entertainment Association. So we focus on game developers. IGEA tends to focus on game publishers. So they represent the multinationals like Activision, Blizzard, and 2K, and all those sorts of folks. But they commissioned this really fantastic report for the last 5 or 6 years they've been doing it. This is the 5th iteration now, called Digital New Zealand, and they do one called Digital Australia. So the Digital New Zealand 18 report, I'll do a quick run over of it because I'll put the link up for it, and the amount of data in there is astounding. It's like some of the best data on consumer use of games I've ever seen. So who's playing games? 79% of households have more than one game device. Like, I think they picked it out that there's 92% of households in New Zealand have a game device. That includes, of course, mobile phones if they're used for games. So this is a survey of I think it's about 3,000 or 4,000 people. Very targeted data, very specific. 93 minutes average daily total play for males. 75 minutes average total daily play for females. Like, they get all these kinds of numbers, but the one that's really interesting to me is 34 years is the average age of video game players in New Zealand. It's not just kids stuff, right? Everybody plays these things. And it's almost a 50-50 split between men and women who's playing games. Reasons people playing: younger adults, passing time and having fun. Working adults, pass time and having fun. Older adults, and they've got a lot of interesting data around folks sort of in the 65 plus range about why they're playing. Keeping the mind active, de-stressing. Lots of good information about parents and video games, how parents are engaging with this stuff. 80% of parents have rules about how their children engage with games, so how much time they're allowed to spend, what kind of games they're allowed to spend. 86% of them are talking to their children about what kind of games they're playing, engaging in that. And lots are sitting down and playing games together, which is really, really good to see. And there's quite a lot of positive sentiment, I guess, towards being able to use games for learning and for work and for skills. There's a couple of studios doing games specifically focused around areas like health and safety and that sort of thing. So this report is available at igea.net. It's one of their most recent news postings, but I think the whole thing is like 40 pages. Like if you want all of their methodology, all of their data sets, it's unbelievably cool. And they've got the same for Australia, so something to consider. So we're just about running out of time. Sorry, it's been a bit of a rush all over the show. Just wanted to suggest a couple of things. Books and tools that I found to be very helpful. So The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell, probably one of the best game design books in the world. It approaches everything in a really wonderfully scaffolded way. I know he's been mentioned by a few people already yesterday and today. Challenges for Game Designers by Brenda Romero and Ian Schreiber. That is a really amazing book because it's all physical games. Every chapter teaches you a game design principle, or several, and then challenges you to make a game off the back of that and explore that concept. A Theory of Fun for Game Design by Ralph Koster is actually 10 years old, which kind of weirds me out saying that. But A Theory of Fun is a really interesting piece, a very quick read, and lots of good sort of thinking points. Game Design Workshop by Tracy Fullerton, again, kind of focusing more on the academic side of things and how they're applied. I had to throw Connected Gaming in there because I really want to read it. I'm very excited about this. So I'm excited to try that. And then on YouTube, the kind of 3 big channels I would suggest having a look at. Game Maker's Toolkit is a series of, on average, about 15-minute videos that breaks down in a really compelling way how games are made, what the mechanics are, and how they function. The Game Developers Conference itself, GDC, they post tons of their videos for free, and that's all just professionals delivering talks at kind of that level. So there may be interesting things in there. And Extra Credits is similar to Game Maker's Toolkit, although a little bit more high energy in some ways. Mark from Game Maker's Toolkit's kind of chill. The Extra Credits folks, I think, pitch shift and speed up their stuff a little bit. So they get through a lot very quickly. But those are areas I'd suggest having a look at.